The air inside the big house was heavy that evening. Not hot exactly, just thick, like it didn't want to move, the kind of air that sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel noticed. Somewhere down the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Slow, careful footsteps, the kind that belonged to someone who knew this house well enough to move through it quietly. Outside, cicadas screamed into the dark, their sound pouring in through open windows like a restless tide. And inside one particular room, a young woman stood perfectly still, her hands folded at her waist, her eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for a man who had already decided the rest of her life. You see, moments like this rarely announce themselves as turning points. There was no thunder, no sudden music swelling in the background, just a lamp flickering slightly on a side table, the faint smell of polished wood and old books, and the soft rustle of fabric as the master of the house adjusted his coat. To anyone passing by, it might have looked ordinary, respectable even. But nothing about this moment was ordinary, because in this room, in this silence, a line was being crossed that could never be uncrossed. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. This wasn't a secret affair hidden in shadows. This wasn't a stolen moment in a barn or a hurried encounter behind closed doors meant to be denied later. No, what was happening here was something far more disturbing. This man, wealthy, respected, married, had decided that the enslaved woman standing in front of him would become something he called his second wife. Imagine that for a second. Not a lover, not a mistress, a wife, in his mind at least. Now, before we go any further, let me slow this down. Because this story isn't just about cruelty. It's about contradiction. About how someone could sit at a dinner table and say grace, speak kindly to neighbors, kiss his lawful wife's hand, and then walk down a hallway and claim ownership over another human being's body, future, and identity, all without seeing himself as a monster. But there was a problem, a very real one, and it walked through the door when no one expected it. Her name, at least the name written in the plantation ledger, was Eliza. She was born on that land, which meant the soil under her feet had known her tears since childhood. She learned early how to read rooms the way other people read books. The tone of a voice, the set of a jaw, the difference between footsteps that meant work and footsteps that meant danger. By the time she was 15, she had already mastered the art of disappearing while standing right in front of someone. Eliza had been assigned to the main house not because of kindness, but because she was quiet, observant, and careful. Those were valuable traits. She cleaned bedrooms where secrets lived in the corners. She carried laundry that still held the warmth and scent of its owners. She learned, without being told, which doors were never to be opened and which questions were never to be asked. And she noticed him noticing her. It started small. A pause when she entered a room. A look that lingered just a second longer than it should have. A request for her to bring something personally, even when others were available. You see, enslaved women learned to recognize this pattern the way sailors learned to read the sky. Because once you saw the clouds forming, you knew a storm was coming. You just didn't know how bad it would be. At first, Eliza told herself it meant nothing. Men looked, men always looked. But this was different. This look carried a sense of decision, as if he weren't just seeing her but planning her. The master of the house, let's call him Thomas because history often remembers men like him by their first names alone, was in his early 40s. He was known in the county as a fair man. Not cruel, people said. He didn't beat his slaves without reason. He attended church every Sunday, he provided well for his family, and his wife Margaret was considered a model of grace and restraint. The kind of woman who hosted teas, managed household accounts, and smiled politely, even when she was exhausted. Outwardly, this was a respectable home. But inside Thomas's mind, respectability had a very flexible definition. You see, he had begun telling himself a story where what he wanted wasn't immoral but natural, where Eliza's silence meant consent, where his power was mistaken for affection. And slowly, dangerously, he began to believe that giving her a special status, nicer clothes, fewer field duties, a private room near his study, was generosity, not control. When he finally spoke to her about it, it wasn't with force. That's what makes this harder to listen to. He spoke calmly, almost gently. He told her she would be protected, that she would be cared for, that she would no longer be treated like the others. He told her she should be grateful. Eliza didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood there, nodding slightly, because she understood something that people watching from the future sometimes forget. Resistance didn't always look like defiance. Sometimes resistance was survival. Sometimes it was staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. Inside, though, something broke, because becoming his second wife didn't mean safety. It meant isolation. It meant being pulled away from the small, fragile community she had among the other enslaved people. It meant being watched more closely, controlled more carefully. It meant being trapped in a role that had no name, no protection, and no escape. And here's the cruelest part. Marguerite, his real wife, knew nothing. Or at least that's what everyone believed. For weeks, this arrangement existed in a strange, unspoken half-world. Eliza was moved into a small bedroom off the study. Thomas visited her under the excuse of work, of needing assistance, of late-night reading. The household staff noticed the changes. They always did. But no one spoke. Silence was safer than truth. Eliza began to feel like a ghost haunting a house she had never been allowed to leave. She heard laughter from the dining room while she sat alone. She listened to Margaret's voice float down the hallway, warm, polite, trusting. Sometimes Eliza caught glimpses of her in mirrors, and the sight made her stomach twist. Because Margaret wasn't cruel. She wasn't unkind. She was just living inside a lie someone else had built around her. And then, one afternoon, something went wrong. It was earlier than usual. Thomas hadn't sent for Eliza. She was in the study, dusting shelves, trying to keep her breathing steady. The door was partially closed. Sunlight spilled across the rug in long, lazy lines. Everything felt suspended, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then Eliza heard footsteps. Not his. These were lighter, measured, familiar in a different way. The door opened. Margaret stood there. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air thickened even more, if that was possible. Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in details she had never bothered to notice before. The extra chair, the folded shawl, Eliza's presence in a place she had no official reason to be, and Eliza felt it then. That terrible, sinking certainty that whatever fragile balance had been holding her life together was about to collapse. Margaret's gaze settled on her, not angry at first, just confused. And confusion, in a house built on secrets, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Because once questions begin, lies have a way of unraveling fast. And the moment Margaret opened her mouth to speak, everything Thomas had so carefully arranged began to fall apart. Now, you might think this is where the story turns into shouting, accusations, dramatic confrontations, but that's not how it happened. Not yet. Because Margaret didn't scream. She asked a question instead, and that question, soft, controlled, trembling just slightly at the edges, would change every single life in that house. What she asked, and what Eliza was forced to understand in that moment, is where this story truly begins. If you're ready, we can keep going, because what followed was not just betrayal, but a slow, devastating revelation of how power poisons everyone it touches. All right, I'm going to continue in the same seamless flow, same voice, same emotional depth. I'll push this as long as the system allows in one response, without breaking tone or structure. This will read like a living, breathing documentary narration. No headings, no breaks. Just the story. Margaret's question didn't come. Out sharp. That's what made it dangerous. It came out steady, polite, almost rehearsed, as if she were asking about a misplaced book or an open window. Why is she here? Thomas turned slowly. You could almost hear the calculation happening behind his eyes, the way a man measures words when he knows the wrong one could destroy him. He smiled first. A mistake. Smiles in moments like that always feel like lies before the lie is even spoken. She was cleaning, he said. I asked her to help organize some papers. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at Eliza then, really looked at her. Not the way slaveholders usually did. Through her, past her, but at her face, her posture, the way her hands trembled just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. Eliza kept her eyes down. She knew better than to meet a white woman's gaze in moments of tension. But inside, her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Margaret took a step into the room. Then another. She noticed the shawl draped over the chair, a woman's shawl, not hers. She noticed the faint scent of soap and lavender that didn't belong to the study, and suddenly, All those little things she'd dismissed over the past weeks, the closed doors, the changed routines, the way Thomas always seemed to be somewhere else, began lining up in her mind like soldiers. Now, this is where it gets strange. Because Margaret didn't explode, she didn't accuse, she did something far more terrifying. She asked Eliza a question. "What is your name?" Eliza hesitated. "Just a second too long. Eliza, ma'am." Margaret nodded slowly. "How long have you been assisting my husband?" The word assisting hung in the air, heavy with doubt. Thomas interrupted. "Margaret, this isn't—" She raised her hand, not dramatically, just enough, and he stopped. That alone told Eliza more than any words ever could. This was a woman used to being obeyed in her own house. Eliza's throat felt dry. She answered carefully. "Some weeks now, ma'am." Margaret's eyes flicked back to Thomas. "Some weeks," she repeated. Not a question. A statement. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself didn't want to intrude. Margaret exhaled slowly. Then she did something no one expected. She told Eliza to leave. "Go," she said gently. "I'll speak with you later." Eliza didn't need to be told twice. She moved past Margaret, her shoulder brushing the doorway, her legs threatening to give out with every step. She didn't run. Running would have been dangerous. She walked, slowly, respectfully, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But behind her the door closed, and behind that door a marriage cracked open. What was said in that room was never written down. No letters survived, no diary entries confessed the truth. But people talk, and enslaved people especially learn to listen. Voices were raised, then lowered, then raised again. Margaret demanded to know why there was a room prepared for Eliza, why her husband had been meeting her alone, why household routines had shifted around one enslaved woman. Thomas defended himself the way men like him always did. He spoke of responsibility, of protection, of providing care. He spoke of how Eliza was different, how she needed guidance, how he was saving her from worse treatment. Margaret laughed at that, a sharp, humorless sound that sliced through the air. "Saving her?" she asked. "From what? From you?" That question changed everything, because Thomas finally said it out loud. He told her he intended to keep Eliza close, that it was already decided, that this arrangement brought order, stability, that other men did the same even if they didn't speak of it. And then, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, he said something that revealed just how deeply slavery had rotted his sense of morality. She should be grateful. Margaret stared at him. Not with rage, not yet. With something colder. "You are calling this gratitude," she said slowly, "because it allows you not to call it what it is." And in that moment, Margaret understood something devastating. Not just about her husband, but about her life, about the house she ran, about the system that supported her comfort. Because Eliza wasn't the problem. Thomas was. But here's the part people rarely talk about. Margaret couldn't simply leave. She had no money of her own, no legal standing, separate from her husband. The house, the land, the slaves, they were his. Even the respect she commanded existed because of his name. So she did what women like her often did when trapped inside men's decisions. She stayed, but staying didn't mean accepting. Margaret began watching everything. She noticed when Eliza was called for. She noticed when meals were rearranged. She noticed the way Thomas's temper flared whenever Eliza was out of sight too long. And slowly, quietly, she began to resist in the only ways available to her. She reassigned Eliza's duties, moved her back among the other enslaved women, made sure she was never alone with Thomas in the main house. She framed it as order, as propriety, as protecting the household's reputation. Thomas protested, angrily, privately. Margaret didn't back down, and Eliza felt the shift immediately. One day she was being treated as something rare and dangerous. The next, she was being watched from every corner. The other enslaved women noticed too. Some avoided her, afraid association might bring punishment. Others whispered prayers for her safety. A few resented her, believing she'd been favored. Eliza felt completely alone. You see, being singled out in slavery was never a gift. It was a spotlight, and spotlights burned. Thomas grew bitter, his control slipping, his authority challenged in the one place he believed it should never be questioned, his home. He couldn't punish Margaret openly. Society wouldn't allow the But he could punish Eliza. And he did. Her workload increased. Her privileges disappeared. Her movements were restricted. She was reminded again and again that she was property, that her brief elevation had been conditional, temporary. And yet, Margaret continued to intervene, not out of friendship, not out of affection, but out of something closer to guilt. She began leaving small things where Eliza would find them: extra bread, a blanket, once a book, left behind on purpose, though Eliza couldn't read it. The gesture mattered more than the object. Sometimes their eyes met across a room. In those moments, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a shared knowledge of the man who controlled both their lives in different ways. But this fragile balance couldn't last, because power hates being challenged. One night, Thomas confronted Margaret openly. He accused her of undermining him, of embarrassing him, of siding with a slave over her own husband. Margaret didn't deny it. "I am siding with what is right," she said. Thomas laughed. "Right," he repeated. "You speak of right, while enjoying everything this system gives you." That hit her. Hard. Because it was true. Margaret realized then that her resistance, while real, was limited. That she could soften cruelty but not erase it. That she benefited from the same structure that crushed Eliza. And Eliza understood something else. She understood that survival meant leaving. But leaving slavery wasn't a decision you simply made. It required opportunity, timing, and sometimes chaos. That chaos came sooner than anyone expected. A sickness swept through the county that winter. Fevers, coughing, weakness that spread from house to house. Thomas fell ill, badly ill, confined to bed. The household thrown into confusion. Margaret took control. Doctors were summoned, orders were given. And in the disruption, something remarkable happened. Eliza was sent out to fetch supplies. Alone. For the first time in months, she stood beyond the gates without immediate supervision. Imagine that moment. The cold air biting her lungs, the road stretching ahead. Freedom not in reach, but visible. She didn't run, not yet, because she knew something even more dangerous than chains was hope without a plan. She returned. She waited. She listened. And when Thomas recovered, weaker, angrier, more desperate to reclaim control, Eliza made her choice. With help from others, people whose names history never recorded, she disappeared one night. No goodbye, no note, just an empty space where she had been. Thomas raged. Margaret said nothing. Eliza was never seen. On that plantation again. Some said she headed north. Others said she changed her name and married free. Others said she was caught and sold far away. The truth is, we don't know. And maybe that's the point, because this story isn't about whether Eliza found happiness. It's about what she endured, about how a system allowed a man to call coercion marriage, ownership affection, and abuse generosity. It's about how power distorts love until it becomes unrecognizable. And it's about how even small acts of resistance, quiet questions, withheld obedience, a door opened at the right moment, can ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. When we talk about slavery, we often talk in numbers, laws, dates, battles. But the truth lives in rooms like that study, in questions whispered instead of screamed, in women forced into roles they never chose, in moments where someone finally asks, "Why is she here?" And once that question is asked, nothing is ever the same again. That's the part of history that doesn't sit quietly. It lingers. It asks us what we would have done. And whether we are brave enough, even now, to call injustice by Eliza did not disappear in a dramatic way. No pounding hooves, no lanterns swinging in the night. Her absence arrived quietly, like so many truths in that house, noticed only after the fact. A missing plate at breakfast, a task left undone, a name not called when the bell rang. At first, Thomas assumed she would be found. Runaways were found all the time, dragged back with stories written on their backs in scars. He sent men down familiar paths, checked neighboring farms, offered polite warnings wrapped in authority. But days passed, then weeks, and Eliza did not return. You see, the thing about control is that it convinces you it's permanent, that once you've claimed something, it will always be there when you reach for it again. Thomas learned, slowly and painfully, that this was not true. Margaret watched him unravel. Not in public, of course. In public, he was still the composed master, still shaking hands, still attending church. But at night, when the house was quiet, his restlessness filled every room. He paced. He snapped at servants. He blamed everyone except himself. And Margaret felt something she had not expected, relief. That realization terrified her. Because relief meant acknowledgement. It meant admitting that Eliza's presence had been a weight on her spirit, a constant reminder of a truth she didn't want to see, that her marriage was not just flawed, but built on a foundation of power that extended beyond her and crushed others. She began to notice things she had once ignored, the way enslaved women flinched when addressed, the way children learned silence before speech, the way laughter stopped when white footsteps approached. It was as if Eliza's absence had sharpened Margaret's vision instead of dulling it. But don't misunderstand. Margaret did not become a hero. She did not free the enslaved. She did not dismantle the system that benefited her. History is rarely that neat. What she did instead was live with the discomfort. And sometimes that discomfort is the beginning of truth. Thomas never spoke Eliza's name again, not aloud, not in the presence of others. But her shadow remained, in the empty room off the study, in the chair that stayed pushed against the wall, in the silence that followed whenever someone mentioned order or gratitude or loyalty. And somewhere far from that house, Eliza was learning how to exist without asking permission. Imagine that first morning after she left, the fear waking her before the sun, the instinct to listen for commands that never came. Freedom, when it arrives suddenly, doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like standing on unfamiliar ground, unsure if it will hold your weight. She had help. People always did, even when history pretended they didn't. A woman who gave her food without asking questions, a man who pointed her toward a road less traveled, a safe place for one night that turned into two. Eliza learned to answer to a different name, learned to lower her eyes for different reasons, learned that safety was temporary but possible. And most importantly, she learned that what had been done to her did not define her worth. Now, let me tell you something important. Stories like Eliza's were not rare. What was rare was interruption, exposure. A moment where the lie cracked enough for someone inside the house to see it clearly. Men like Thomas often convinced themselves they were exceptions, that their actions were justified, that the women they abused were somehow willing participants in their own captivity. And society helped them believe that because acknowledging the truth would have meant questioning everything. But every now and then something went wrong. A door opened at the wrong time. A question was asked too plainly. A silence stretched too long. And when that happened, the illusion shattered. Margaret carried that fracture with her for the rest of her life. She became quieter, sharper, less willing to look away. She never spoke of Eliza, but she never forgot her either. Some nights she lay awake wondering if the young woman had survived, if she had found kindness somewhere in the wide, indifferent world. Thomas, on the other hand, hardened. Men who lose control rarely soften. He tightened his grip on everything else, his land, his workers, his household, trying to fill the space Eliza left behind. But it never quite worked. Because once power is challenged, it never feels absolute again. Years later, long after Eliza was gone, a young enslaved girl was assigned to the main house. She was quiet, careful, watching everything. Thomas noticed her. Margaret noticed too. And this time she intervened early, firmly, without explanation. "No," she said. And for once, Thomas listened. Not because he had changed, but because something in the house had. That's how history really moves. Not in grand speeches or sudden awakenings, but in small, uneven steps. In moments where someone decides not to repeat what was done before. Eliza never knew that. She never knew her absence had altered anything. She never knew her survival had forced a reckoning, however incomplete. And maybe that's the hardest part. So many acts of resistance go unseen. So many lives endure pain without ever witnessing the ripple they create. We like stories with clear victories, clear endings, but real life rarely offers that comfort. What it offers instead are questions. What does it mean to call something love when consent is impossible? What does it mean to call yourself good while benefiting from cruelty? And what does it take to finally ask out loud, why is she here? Because once that question is asked, truly asked, history shifts. Not enough, not fast enough, but enough to matter. Eliza's story reminds us that survival itself can be a form of rebellion, that silence can hold strength, that even in the darkest systems, humanity finds ways to breathe, and it reminds us, too, that the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound respectable, that wear the language of care while hiding control beneath it. The past is not distant. It lives in the questions we choose to ask and the ones we choose to ignore. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person walking into the room at the wrong moment and refusing to look away. Its true name